Hello everyone, my name is Ananya Chanda and I am the Assistant Professor of Adamus University from the Department of Pharmaceutical Technology and School of Health and Medical Sciences. Today, I will be discussing about the scope of anatomy and physiology. So these are the content of the presentation. First, there will be introduction, then levels of organization of human body, scope of the anatomy and physiology, and definition of various terminologies in anatomy. So, what is anatomy? First, let us discuss that the systemic study of the human body is performed under the two disciplines, that is, anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the study of different structures of the body and their relationship with each other. So, in the Greek word, it means take apart by cutting the structure. Next comes the physiology, which means the function of the living organism. Next is the level of the organization. Next comes the levels of organization of the human body. So, anatomical structures and physiology mechanisms are arranged in a series of interacting levels of organization at the chemical or molecular level of organization. Chemical interacts to form complex molecules with distinctive properties. These molecules interact to form a cell. The cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of metabolism of organism. The human body is made up of millions of cells of different types, each with its own form and functions. The cells are organized in tissue. Tissues combine to form organs, and organs work together to form organ systems. So this organ system actually create a whole organism. So this anatomy is divided into four different parts. First is gross anatomy, then the microscopic anatomy, then the superficial anatomy, then comes the comparative anatomy. So, this gross anatomy is also known as topographical anatomy or the regional anatomy, or it is also known as anthropotomy. So, it actually includes what? A anatomical structure that can be seen with the naked eyes. Next comes the microscopic anatomy. So, this microscopic anatomy actually details about a very minute anatomical structures like tissues and cells with the help of microscope. Thirdly, superficial anatomy. This type of anatomy is of prime importance as it includes the study of anatomical structures that can be seen from the body. With the knowledge of superficial anatomy, physicians or veterinary surgeons actually can determine the position and anatomy of the associated deeper structure. And lastly, there is comparative anatomy. This comparative anatomy actually compares both the gross anatomy and the microscopic anatomy of a living organism. So, what is the scope of anatomy and physiology? So, why do we need the anatomy and physiology? It actually helps in understanding the physiology, that is the normal physiology of a living organism, and pathophysiology. Pathophysiology means the disease condition or why the disease is occurring on a particular organ or a body. Next comes the human evolution and development. It actually helps in studying the evolution and the development of the human organ system. Thirdly, it details study with the with seeing the complexity of the structure and the function of the organs. And next is the health related field training scope. And lastly, it helps in the technique of the surgery in the health of medical sciences. Then comes the definition of various terminologies used in the anatomy. So there are three terms that can be used in the anatomy and physiology. First is directional terms. So these directional terms actually describes the positions of the structures relative to other structures or locations in the body. Then comes the planes of body that I will be discussing in the next slide. Thirdly is the body cavities. So these body cavities are actually the spaces or hollow area where the body contains the internal organs or delicate organs. So they are actually divided into two cavities. Firstly is the ventral and the dorsal cavity. So this ventral cavity is known as the larger cavity present in our human being, and it is subdivided into two parts, that is thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities by the diaphragm and dome-shaped respiratory muscle. So these are the directional terms. So firstly is the superior or the cranial direction. It actually means when our body is towards the when the head of our body is at the upper portion. For example, the hand is a part of the superior extremity. Then comes the inferior or caudal, which is away from the head, that is the lower portion. For example, the foot is a part of the inferior body part. Then comes the anterior or the ventral. It denotes the front part of the body. For example, the kneecap is located on the anterior side of the leg. Next comes the posterior or the dorsal. It actually denotes the back side of the body, where, for example, the shoulder blades are located on the posterior side of the body. Next comes the supine, actually, where the front face is facing towards the roof side, while the back is faces downwards. And thirdly is the prone. Prone is actually the vice versa of the supine position, where the face is facing towards the downward or the ground surface. Next comes the medial. Medial actually defines the middle line or the middle part of the body. For example, the middle toe is located at the medial side of the foot. Then comes the lateral. Lateral is denotes the midline away from the, suppose this is the midline, it is away from the midline, is known as medial. For example, the middle toe is located at the medial side of the foot. Then comes the lateral, that is the away from the midline of the body. Next is the proximal, which is toward or nearest the trunk or the point of the origin of a part. For example, the proximal end of the femur joins with the pelvic bone. Then comes the distal, that is the away from or the furthest from the point of attachment. It actually means when the hand is located at the distal end of the forearm. Next is the planes of the body. So this plane of the body are divided into four parts. That is coronal plane, which is known as frontal plane. Then comes sagittal plane, also known as lateral plane. Then comes the axial plane, that is transverse plane. And then comes the median plane. So what is coronal plane? Coronal plane defines a vertical plane running from the side to side, divides the body or any of its part into the anterior and posterior position. Next comes the sagittal part. Here you can see the diagram. That is for the coronal part, you can see that is a vertical plane is running from the side to side, which divides the body or any of its part into anterior, that is front, and the posterior part. Then comes the sagittal part. This one is the sagittal part or the sagittal plane, which is also known as lateral plane. So it is a vertical plane which is running from front to back which is running from where? From the front to back. And it divides the body or any of its part into right and the left side. Then comes the axial plane, that is its transverse plane. This is the transverse or the axial plane, right? So it does what? It is a horizontal plane which divides the body or any of its part into into this upper and the lower part. Next is the median plane, that is the sagittal plane through the midline of the body. Actually, it divides the midline of the body into right half and the left halves. Next is the body cavity. First is this is the body cavity. Here you can see the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity, right? So this ventral cavity is the largest cavity present in our body. So this ventral cavity actually contains what? The thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity and abdominopelvic cavity. Then comes this dorsal cavity. So this dorsal cavity is actually contains cranial cavity, spinal cavity and pelvic cavity. So the cavities does what? It actually helps to protect the delicate and the internal organs in our body. So firstly is the thoracic cavity. So it is the upper ventral thoracic or chest cavity which contains what? Heart, lungs, trachea, esophagus, large blood vessels and nerves. So this thoracic cavity is bound laterally by the ribs, covered by costal pleura, and the diaphragm caudally, covered by the diaphragmatic pleura. Next comes the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. So this is the lower part of the ventral cavity and it can further be divided into two portions. That is the abdominal portion and the pelvic portion. The abdominal cavity contains mostly the GIT, that is gastrointestinal tract, as well as the kidneys and adrenal glands. The abdominal cavity is bound cranially by the diaphragm, laterally by the body wall, and caudally by the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity contains most of the urinogenital system, that is urinary system, as well as the rectum. The pelvic cavity is bounded cranially by the abdominal cavity, dorsally by the sacrum, and laterally by the pelvis. Next is the dorsal cavity. So this is the smaller of the two main cavities called the dorsal cavity. As its name suggests, it contains organs lying more posterior in the body. So this dorsal cavity actually holds mostly the posterior part of the organs in our body. The dorsal cavity again can be divided into two portions, that is the upper portion or the cranial cavity that actually contains what? The brain, and the lower portion contains the vertebral column, which actually encrypt what? The spinal cord. So this is up to this chapter. I hope you understand. So these are the references and thank you.